time for us to check back in with Alex Stewart and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, please look in the description below for a playlist. I asked Alex about the hardest work he ever did. "Driving steel," he answered quickly. During the latter part of the last century, railroad building in America reached its peak, and it continued well into the first part of this century. The locomotives could operate economically only on relatively low grades, and in the southern Appalachian region, this meant many great cuts, fills, and tunnels through the rugged terrain. Most all of such work involved solid rock. The method used in removing solid rock was to drill holes in the stone and then place powder inside for purposes of blasting. The earliest means of drilling these holes was the driving of a steel rod or bit into the solid rock. One man assumed a kneeling position, holding the bit and turning it slightly every time it was struck. The striker or driver wielded a heavy hammer, frequently weighing 10 pounds. The shaker's life was at stake every time the driver hurled the heavy hammer through the air to strike a blow. A miss or a glancing lick on the bit could be fatal to the shaker. Also, the top of the bit, because of repeated blows from the hammer, would become frayed and peel off. If these steel burrs were not cleaned off, they could fly off with the speed of a bullet and seriously injure, even kill, the shaker. When the steam-powered steel driving machine was introduced in the mid to late 1800s, there was opposition to it among the workers. Some feared it would replace too many workers, and others doubted the machine's capabilities. This conflict was dramatized for the entire nation when a contest ensued between the new steam drill and a black steel driver named John Henry. It took place in Big Bend Tunnel in West Virginia, where the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad was constructing one of their lines. John Henry, according to tradition, took a 20-pound hammer in each hand and entered the race with the steam rig. At the end of 35 minutes, the engine had drilled one hole 9 feet deep. John Henry had drilled 2 7-foot holes in the solid rock, easily beating the controversial contraption. But he had so strained himself that he burst a blood vessel and died. From this was born one of America's best-known folk songs, John Henry, the Steel Driving Man. This famous contest took place about 1873, but 35 years later, much of the steel driving in the rugged mountains of East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia was still being done by hand. It is interesting that Alex would quickly identify this romantic yet extremely hazardous occupation as being the hardest work he ever did. I asked him to tell us about his steel driving experiences. Uncle Luke took the contract to clear and grade for the railroad they was building around Appalachia, Virginia, and he begged me off up there. He come through one morning with a string of wagons, and I caught them and rode up to where he's a-working. He wanted me to help cook. It was just his wife and a girl they raised, cooking for the gang of men. I helped cook for a right smart while. Finally, he put me to shaking steel. I was working with 2 fellers from over here on the river. I was the shaker, and I'd sit there for 10 hours a day, all humped up in the dirt and dust, shaking that steel. One day, that big sledgehammer glanced off and hit me right here on the side of the knee. And oh, that like to have killed me. Made me so sick for an hour or two that I couldn't hardly live. I looked up and I said, if this is the only job that I've got, then I ain't got nary one. Ed Johnson was driving the steel, the one that hit me. He said, here, you take the hammer and you drive till you hit me. I said, I don't want to do that, Ed. I never did drive no steel. Well, he said, by God, you ain't too old to learn. So I took the hammer and I went to driving, and I drove 9 straight weeks. And then they was 2 that come up from North Carolina, Ralph and Sam, and Uncle Luke, he didn't like them and didn't hire none. Well, they come and asked him for a job, and he told them that he generally didn't work no colored folks. Well, they come up and asked him for a job, and he told them that he generally didn't work no colored folks. but he never could keep still drivers, and he asked them could they drive still. And one of them said, "I's a still driving fool." Well, Uncle Luke, he's as wicked as the booger man, and he said, "I'll try you, and if you can't, you can go down the road a running." So Ralph and Sam went to driving, and I went back to shaking. One day Ralph says to me, "I's going to let you drive still a while," said, "I got a hurtin' in my shoulder and can't do no good at it today." So I got the hammer. It was a cold morning, and I commenced driving, and I hit that drill a hard lick, and it broke in two, right above his hand, as smooth as if you took a saw and cut it off. Uncle Luke was standing as close as from here to that door, standing a-watching us. Oh, he commenced cussing and giving us the devil. I never said a word. I just laid my hammer down and went up there to where my coat was laying on a big rock, and I took it and put it on, and he said right snappy, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Well, I'm through." He said, "I God, no you ain't." Said, "Come here and go to driving that still." I said, "No, I'll never work another lick for you what time I live, Uncle." And I quit him right there and never did strike another tap for him. Wasn't it pretty hard to work up there in Virginia as a day laborer, not seeing your family for long periods of time? That's why I didn't work there any more than I had to. But there wasn't no work here during the winter, and that was about the only chance. In pioneer times, the counties required all the able-bodied men to contribute a certain number of days' work on the roads. Do you remember that practice? I sure do remember that. If you was 21 years old, you had to pay $3 a year road tax or work on the roads 6 days. Before I got to be 21, I worked Pap's time. We used a pick and shovel and a great big old sledgehammer. We'd bust them rocks up and put them in the big deep ruts and in the chug holes so you could sort of get over the roads with a wagon and a team. After I got to be 21, I had to work for me and Pat both. They made me an overseer, and all I had to do was supervise the other men and keep a check on who showed up. If someone brought a team of mules or horses to haul the dirt and rock, then that counted for 2 days of work. Back then, nobody had any money, and so just about everybody worked off their taxes. Later on, they put a tax on your land, and that's when they done away with you having to work on the roads. The tax on a farm would just be $3 or $4 a year, and now I pay $290-some a year in property taxes on this farm. Alex, you were about the right age to have been drafted in World War I, but you didn't have to go. What happened? I was in Dickinson County, Virginia, helping build an incline about a mile straight up a mountain. The boss come up one day and said, "Is there a feller here by the name of Alex Stewart?" He reached me a letter, and I just stuck it in my pocket. He said, "You better take a look at that letter. It's from Uncle Sam." Well, I broke it open, and it ordered me to report to Sneedville the next day by 1 o'clock to be examined for the Army. I was a-shoveling, and I just put my shovel down and went on down to get paid off. They didn't have any paper money, and they had to pay me off in nickels, dimes, and quarters. Just as they got the money counted out, the train whistle blowed. I didn't have time to get no permit nor ticket nor nothing. I just run to catch the train, and my pockets was so weighted down with all that silver that I could barely run. I rode to St. Paul, then I hooked a freight train to Norton, and then I caught one down to Ben-Hur and got in there about 3 o'clock in the night, and it didn't cost me a penny. I walked on home, and Margie was up getting breakfast. I drank a cup of coffee and pulled out to Sneedville, and it was 3 o'clock when I got there. Dr. Daughtry was give up to be one of the greatest surgeons anywhere around, and him and another doctor examined me. Well, I'd been working and on the go for 2 days and a night and no sleep and nothing to eat in 24 hours, and I was as gaunt as you could get, pert near it. When they weighed me, I weighed 102 pounds. Dr. Daughtry said to the other doctor, "That's the best little man ever I saw, but he's too light." They let me go, and they called me about a year later, but armistice was signed before I reported, and I didn't get to go. I wished 1,000 times I would have gone. Franklin Roosevelt's WPA, Works Progress Administration, came into Hancock County in the summer of 1935. The pay was $2.50 a day, $2.50 a day, as compared to 75 cents a day for most other work, and jobs of any kind weren't easy to come by in those Depression years. Alex had inquired about a job with the WPA because, as he said, he was trying to feed 9 children and times was hard. He had talked with the person in charge who promised him a job, and that official sent his brother over to talk with Alex. His brother come to see me and bragged on how handy I was and what a good job I could do. I told him I'd sure try because I needed the money. He said, "Well, they's a job for you, but my brother wants to talk to you. He wants you to promise to vote with him, and he wants you to trade with him at his store." I says, "You tell your brother to take his job and go to hell with it." Alex raised his voice considerably when he came to the go to hell part. I think that was the first time I'd heard him use the word. I says, "I don't sell out." Well, for years they wouldn't speak to me, and little did I care. Many people your age left Tennessee for better farmlands in the West. Did you ever consider leaving this country? I left here 2 different times looking for land, but I always came back. One fall, when the corn and fodder had made itself and was getting ripe, I decided to go out to Indiana. They was a feller from here that had gone out there, and he wanted me to come buy a farm close to him. I went out there and looked around, but I come on home. You didn't buy any land in Indiana? No, the land out there was all right, just as level as this floor, but the people weren't nigh as friendly as they are here. After I got back home, they asked me how I liked the people out there. Why, I told them the dogs in Tennessee are a lot friendlier than the people are in Indiana. You said you made it 2 trips out west. Where did you go the second time? I went to Oklahoma. The land out there didn't look like it would grow anything much. It was pretty level and smooth, but it was white. Old white puffy looking land. You couldn't raise no corn out there on account of the sandstorms. If it come a sandstorm about the time the corn got up waist high, it would cut every bit of it down. I had an uncle that lived there, and he had a garage piled full of cow chips. Yeah, that wind out there would dry it out just right away. A dry cow pile would burn for 2 or 3 hours when you set it afire. They lived hard out there for a long, long time. I wouldn't have moved out there if they'd give me a farm. Even though you like farming, it seems that you had to work a great many other jobs because the pay was so much better. Yeah, I worked a little over 5 years in the coal mines over here in Virginia. They've tried to get me to sign up for this black lung benefits, said I could draw a pension. I said no, as long as I can live without it, I ain't going to. I've done just about every kind of work there is to do about the mines. I've laid a heap of track, and I've helped build them big concrete pillars for the railroad tracks going up to the mines. And I've shot and loaded a heap of coal. I've worked in seams only 18 inches high, and I'd get 5 cents a bushel for drilling, shooting, and loading the coal. Did it by the contract, and I've worked in there 36 hours many a time before I'd sleep. I sure have. I'd work all day, all night, and all day the next day. I'd stop long enough to eat, and back I'd go. You could work as long as you wanted to back then. Then I worked as a brakeman, as a spragger. Them cars would start rolling too fast when they come down a steep grade, and I'd stand at a certain point in the tunnel and jab a piece of iron in the spokes of the car wheel to lock it and slow it down. Did you ever do any timbering in the mines? Yeah, I've set timber many a day. Had to keep that top propped up to keep the slate from falling on you. I suppose the mines were pretty dangerous, especially at the time you worked there. I never did get hurt bad. I've hurt my knees and legs where slate would fall on me, but never did get my head or body hurt. I'd always be careful overhead. You could take your crowbar and peck it and tell what it would do. The sound would tell you whether it was solid or loose, and if it didn't sound right, you'd better get it, the loose rock and slate, down. If you take that down, you're in pretty good shape, but lots of people just didn't do it, and it got them killed. There's one feller that I never was so sorry for in my life. He lived right over here next to me, and he was one of the best fellers I ever got acquainted with. He went back in the mines and got killed the first day. Then there was a hunk come in up there at Stonga and went to work. He'd never been in the mines before. Back then you had to buy your own tools, a shovel, pick, crowbar, and lights. He bought him an outfit and went in there to work, and worked about a week. He was going in at night and had his pick on his shoulder. The pick hit that electric wire and it killed him. Yes, sir, I was there and I helped take him out. What did you call him, a hunk? Yeah, a hunk. What's a hunk? That's just one of those foreigners. I don't know where they was from, but you couldn't a bit more understand them than you could a goose. He was just a regular hunk. Did they have any mules or ponies in the mines? Oh yeah, they had mules in there, lots of them. They was mules that never seed daylight from the time they put them in there until they died or got killed. They'd feed them and water them and everything in there. They stayed there all their lives. That was sort of cruel, wasn't it? Yeah, it sure was. The fellers that I worked with at Stonga, they'd come out with a dead mule just every few days. Them mules would raise their heads a little too high and their ears would touch that electric wire. That would get them nearly every time. In a way, the mule was better off than the miner. If a mule got crippled up or killed, the company had to buy another one. But if a miner got killed or hurt, all they had to do was hire another one. So they tried to take care of their mules. Did you ever help make coke? I've helped burn a lot of coke up here in Virginia. They had great long rows of coke ovens, and we'd fill them with coal and burn them for 24 hours to make coke. Coke will put out so much more heat than coal will, and it don't smoke. You can take coke and melt steel with it. Oh, it was a hot job, and none of the white men could stand it much. Sweat drops would come on you as big as a nickel. Alex, you've mentioned the many different things you've done to make a living, but you haven't mentioned sawmilling. The sawmill that you and Sam have now, I know it was here the first time I met you. Oh, I've worked in a sawmill on and off might near all my life. I worked at a sawmill for my uncle before I married. I worked as an off-bearer. That's where you carry them big green slabs away as fast as they fall. Buddy, that's a job. It'll kill you. They paid me 50 cents a day for a long time, and they finally got up to $1 a day, and I thought I was rich. Years later, me and Henry Sergner went up to Ohio. He had a boy up there, and we bought us a sawmill, paid $650 for it, and went down here to Red Hill and bought an engine off of George Hatfield to run it with. Me and Henry run that mill 2 or 3 years, and then me and Sam bought Henry out, and we run it for over 40 years. Sam got a truck, and he'd go haul the logs until the truck wore out, and then he'd just let people bring their own logs. Law at the lumber we sawed on that mill. Alex, we're always talking about the different things you've done and how hard you've worked, but we've never talked much about your health through the years. Have you had much sickness? I was bothered a heap with my stomach. Had them little eel worms after I got married, and they eat the lining out of my stomach. Oh, that like to have killed me. The doctor said they would kill me if I didn't get rid of them. I suffered with that, but I never quit work, never stopped. The doctor said you could build your stomach lining back by eating raw eggs. He said every time you get a chance, you eat a raw egg. I found that they was good, and I made a crop one summer eating nary a thing in the world but raw eggs. I'd punch a hole in the little end and just turn it up and drink it down. Why, I got to where I could swallow them just as fast as I could break them. I made barrel staves that summer and hauled them over to Ben-Hur, Virginia, and raw eggs is what I lived on. I bet I didn't eat 2 pounds of bread the whole time. I'd suck 5 and 6 eggs 2 and 3 times a day. Eggs was high, and I didn't always have enough to do me, and I couldn't afford to buy 'em. I was going across the mountain one day taking a load of staves. I'd run short on eggs that day, didn't have none to take with me. I had an awful heavy load of staves, and the road was bad and muddy. I was just letting my team take their time, and I stopped to rest them. Right above the road, there sat a hen on a nest. I said, "If you've got any eggs, I'll get 'em." I sat there and looked at her a while, and I got down, and she flew off, and I got 8 eggs out of that nest. I ate 5 of them right there, and I took the rest of them home and ate them the next morning. Abraham Lincoln, who lived over here in Kentucky at one time, was known as the rail splitter. I think you've split a few rails yourself. I've made thousands and thousands of rails. When I first started making them, I'd get $1 for splitting rails and laying them into a fence. I saw some rails the other day that priced at $7 each. That's 700 times what you got. That's hard to believe, isn't it? Yeah, and I had to lay my rails up, build a fence out of them before I got my penny apiece for them. You had to put 2 props at every corner to keep it from falling over. How many rails could you split in a day? If I had good straight grain chestnut, I could split 200 or 300. That's just splitting and not laying them up. Young white oak, where it grows in rich soil, splits pretty good, but nothing beats good chestnut. Of course, the chestnut is all gone now, killed by the blight. Alex, we've talked a good deal about the many types of work you did and how hard it was to make a living for your large family. Was there ever a time when you were concerned about whether you could make it or not? Son, I've rolled in the bed many a night studying how I was going to feed my family the next day. Chapter 7, The Arts and Crafts of Alex Stewart. There was a time when nobody had handier hands than me. It is incredible that one man could learn and successfully engage in as many skilled activities, arts, and crafts as has Alex Stewart. If he wasn't a master of all, he at least learned them well enough to gain the approval and respect of his peers. We've talked about the various trades and occupations Alex followed to make a living: farming, mining, steel driving, railroad building, log rafting, sawmilling, to mention a few. In this chapter, we'll look at activities which, though often helpful in sustaining the family, were taken up mostly for the pleasure and satisfaction of engaging in new and challenging pursuits. Alex tended to occupy himself by doing the things he enjoyed rather than working at tasks which might pay well or be considered prestigious. He told me a little story once which illustrates this characteristic. Old Dr. Mitchell came to our house once when I was just a boy and saw a walking cane that I'd made standing in the corner. It was all fancied up and had animals and things carved all around on it. He said, "Bringer?" He always called me Bringer. "Did you make that cane?" I told him that I did, and he said, "Now that's a mighty fine job. But if you can do that, why, you can do something that will make you a lot more money." Well, I've studied about that a lot, and I've decided that he was just about right. Despite the fact that he made little or no money from his crafts, Alex continued to engage in them throughout his life. The sheer number and variety of his endeavors are simply staggering. He himself put it quite well. Somebody, Charlie McDonald, I think it was, asked me the other day if I knew how many things I'd worked at. I said I never built no ships, nor no freight trains, but anything else I can think of, I worked at it a little. I undertook to count up all the kinds of work I'd followed, and I got to 150 some odd, and I just quit. I said, "Shucks, this ain't paying me nothing. I bet there ain't another feller living that's made more different kinds of things than I have. I've made everything that I took a notion to make." Alex is extremely knowledgeable and skillful in dozens of areas relating to early crafts and mountain activities, but he gained national attention as an old-time mountain cooper. Alex, tell me how you got your start as a cooper. Well, after I got married and got me a cow, I realized I didn't have no churn to churn my butter in. And when I went up to Pap's to get him to make me one, he had him an order to make 6 chairs, but he said, "Quick as I get this order filled, I'll make you one." Well, I sat there a few minutes and helped him bottom a chair, and I got to thinking, and I said, "Dad, I'll be working if you don't care, making up the staves for the churn." When I got the staves rived out, I just went ahead and joined them, made my bands, and started putting it together. By the time he had his chairs done, I had the churn done. I brought it around and showed it to him. He looked up at me and said, "Well, son, you've got me beat. I'm sure proud of you." And that was the first vessel that I ever made. Of course, I'd watched Pap and Grandpap too, and I'd been pretty anxious to try it, but Pap never did want to risk me too far with it. He's afraid I'd waste the timber. But I didn't, and I made a good one. It took me 3 days to make it. I laid it on my shoulder one evening. I lived about 3.5 miles down in the valley, and I started home with it. I was about halfway home when an old man come riding up. His name was Ruth Anderson. He says, "What you got there?" I said, "A churn." Of course, he knowed what I had, but he just asked anyway. He said, "Hand it up here. I want to look at it." I reached it up to him, and he looked it over, took the lid off, and rolled it around, and he says, "That sure is a good one. What will you take for it?" I said, "Mr. Anderson, I don't want to sell it. I've got me a cow now, and I ain't got no churn." He said, "My churns give out, and we can't churn, and I've been trying to find me one. What do you get for one?" I said, "Well, Pap always gets $2 a piece for 'em. He said, "I'm aiming to give you $3 for this one." Back then, $1 looked bigger to me than $50 does today, and I decided to let him have it. The next day, I went back to Pap's and told him what I'd done. He said, "Well, I don't blame you." Said, "If you can make one, you can make 2. I put in and made me another one, and that's how I got started in the cooper trade. Alex has been called the country's best-known old-time cooper. Elliot Wigginton's popular book, Foxfire 3, devotes 29 pages and some 60 photographs to Alex Stewart, the cooper. It was mainly because of his renown as a cooper that Alex was featured on the cover of The Craftsman in America, a hardcover book published by the National Geographic Society. Most of his notoriety is based on his work as a cooper or barrel maker, and an entire chapter could be devoted to the various aspects of this subject. For example, the top wood used to make a keg depended on whether it was to contain water, milk, liquor, honey, and so on. But because his work as a cooper is so well known, it will not be discussed at length here. Mention should be made, however, of some of the types of staved containers which Alex has made. They include churns, buckets, tubs of all sizes, barrels, kegs, piggins, butter bowls, and firkins. Some of the non-staved pieces include dough trays, wooden spoons and forks, rolling pins, bowls, and countless other items which were not then available at the corner store. I've talked to you before about basket making. Lord, I've made many a basket, mostly out of white oak. It makes the best baskets, and they'll last the longest. I've made them out of wheeler, broomcorn, and honeysuckle. Tell me about making a white oak basket. The most important thing about making a basket is selecting your timber. You want a white oak sapling about 6 or 8 inches through in diameter. Now, it has to be perfectly straight, no limbs, no knots, and the bark has to be straight and sort of soft. You can take your hand and feel the bark, and if it feels rough and tough, why, you don't want it. You want to get timber that's growed on the north side of the mountain and where the soil is rich. North-grown timber is 1/3 better than timber grown on the south side of the mountain, and your basket will last 1/3 longer. If you take a split made from timber that's growed on the south side of the mountain, you can blow through it like blowing through a piece of cloth. It's so open-grained. If you make a basket out of it, you ain't got much. It won't last. The soil has more to do with timber than just about anything else. You can take timber that's growed on real poor land and it's no good. If you want good timber, go to where the soil's good. Always cut it on the old of the moon. It's a heap better to cut it when the sap is down, but you can cut it any time of the year just as long as it's on the old of the moon. To make a nice basket, you want to get your splits thin, as thin might near as paper. If you work it when it's green, you can take and tie it in a knot. It's so soft and strong. The width of your split depends on the size of your basket. If you're making a small basket, you need to have narrow splits, but if you're making a big basket, you can use wider splits. The biggest basket ever I made held 5 bushel. They was an old man, Ross Lawson, who lived over here on the river ridge. He come up to my place when I lived on the ridge and asked if I could make a 5 bushel basket. Said he wanted it to carry shucks to his cows. Baskets made from broomcorn were very unusual, weren't they? Yeah, I never did know of anybody else except Grandpap making them. You have to get that hull from the stalk when it's green, just before it gets ready to shed its bloom. If you let it get too ripe, it'll get brittle and it'll break when you start to work with it. Just another fascinating peek into the life of Alex Stewart. Starts out with, again, talking about how he worked, his work ethic. Such an amazing variety of jobs he did over the years. I especially enjoyed that first part about the railroad. I can't imagine how tough that was to try to build a railroad with your hands, to drive that steel. And John Rice Irwin mentions the song, John Henry was a steel driving man. You've probably heard the song, but if you've not, I will link to it down below. Another kind of similar song, this is one of my favorite Tony Rice. Lots of people sing it, but Tony Rice's version is my favorite, is 9 Pound Hammer. So it's kind of the same thing about being strong enough to actually use those big hammers. I can't even hit with a regular hammer, like a carpentry hammer. I can't even ever hit the nail right. Matt amazes me. Of course, he was a builder for many years, so he had a lot of practice. But he also amazes me when he has to use a sledgehammer. I can barely lift it off the ground, but he can put it behind his head and then hit what he means to hit, which is amazing. Just like the Alex Stewart was describing, such hard work, but such talented craftsmen that actually could do the work, and being strong like John Henry. The part he was talking about it being dangerous, you can just imagine, and Alex got hurt, but you can imagine other people, there's probably worse injuries and probably deaths from that hammer missing and hitting people. And then also it was talking about how the top of the steel would get smashed down and then it would come off in pieces. That happened to Matt one time when he was building, I don't remember which house or where he was at, but he was hammering, or maybe he was pulling something out, but with a big hammer, and a piece of steel come out and it flew. I think he was prying something out maybe, and it flew and it went into his, went through his shirt. He had a shirt on. He went through his shirt into his chest, and we got a lot of it out, but there's still a piece of metal in there. You can feel it. There's still a piece of metal. So that's very dangerous work when you're working with your hands and working with those big heavy hammers like that. Another peek that we got again was of Alex's, his stubbornness and unwillingness to kind of yield in situations. I would say his strength, where with his Uncle Luke, he had enough. He was through, and there wasn't no talking to him. He's going to the house. So again, we get a peek at his stubborn nature there, that he took a lot, and he was just, like I said, such a long-suffering, hard worker. But when he had enough, he had enough. When he was through, he was through. So that's another theme that we've seen through the whole book. You've definitely seen it in this part. Interesting when John Rice thought to ask him about his health, and he talked about his stomach. The worm was ELL, worm. So I don't know what that is. I've never heard of it. Never heard of being able to eat eggs to replace the lining of your stomach, but it sounds like he really had some suffering days during that. But as he pointed out, he just kept working because he had to. He didn't have no choice. Somebody had to provide for his family. Another part of that working stuff that was interesting, I thought, was the way that, and I've read that before in other accounts, is how that everyone, there was no taxes, so everyone had to pitch in to help with the roads and had to work, so either pay or work so many hours or so many days a year. Kind of reminds me, in those days, a lot of places when you give donations were like that. You didn't donate money because people didn't have money as much. Or certainly a lot of people in Appalachia didn't, but it really reminded me of when the John C. Campbell Folk School was being built, was going to be built, and going to be here. the people of Brasstown, they pledged. They didn't have money to pledge, but I've looked at some of those pledge cards. They were trying, the people of Brasstown, especially Fredo Scroggs, he's really who organized the people to kind of, they wanted the folk school to be here, so they were trying to kind of entice them. So when they'd come back again, they had all these pledge cards where people had promised to help. And they were things like what Alex was talking about. So they might pledge 1 day of work with a team of horses and a wagon for 3 years in a row, that they would come work with that. Of course, they pledged different, somebody pledged chairs. They would make chairs, kind of like Alex's daddy was making. They even pledged plants like daffodils and different things, but a lot of it was work. They would pledge so many days' work, so many loads of firewood, those kind of things. So in those days, that was much more common than just giving a monetary donation, because people didn't have the monetary donation to give, but they had ample time and work as far as what they did every day. They were like Alex. They were doing that hard work anyway. But it is interesting to note, like I said, I'd read that before, but that the state actually required you to do that because that's the only way they had to keep up the roads, to keep up the road system. So I love that part about the railroads, like I said, but I also love the ending where we started the new chapter that's going to be about Alex's craftsmanship. So many times when you look back through Appalachian history and people that have studied it, they often talk about the poor conditions, and we certainly read some of those poor conditions earlier in the book about Alex and the people that he lived around when it talked about the horrible sanitary conditions. So certainly extreme poverty. Those places existed. Even in the area where I'm at, people, those things existed for sure. But a lot of times that's what those kind of scholars or books or whatever, they want to focus on that part. And they leave out the beauty that those people, even though they might have been poor, living in poverty, abject poverty, they still looked for a creative way to have beauty around them. I think that's easily seen, of course, in the things they planted around their house, flowers and that kind of stuff. Of course, you think of utilitarian things like blankets and quilts that they had to make, dresses and bonnets and all those things they made. Also, even down to when they were building a house or something, the stonework on a chimney, or the stonework where they piled rocks out of their garden to create a garden. All those different ways of being creative. I have the very first video that I put up on the Celebrating Appalachia channel was about the creativity that can be found in the Appalachian Mountains, and give some wonderful examples in that, so I will definitely link to that. I also loved kind of the last little part we read, a 5-bushel basket. Could you imagine? I think I could get in it. I'm pretty sure I could get in that. So gosh, could you imagine? I would love to have seen that. That just blows my mind, a 5-bushel basket. Now, if you were hauling corn shucks like that farmer wanted for fodder, that you think that'd be really light, but you think about putting even something like green beans, 5 bushels of green beans, that would have been a hefty load. So it makes me wonder if a bushel or a basket that big for 5 bushels, if it was used for anything else, or if it just had to be something light like the corn shucks would be. Please leave a comment and tell me what part you liked out of the reading today. And as always, I hope you drop back by next Friday, because we've got to find out what happens to Alex next. And sounds like we're going to hear more about his life as a craftsman.